Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I'll Never Told You, production of iHeartRadio. And we're back with our SMNTY fiction segment, which is a once-a-month thing that we do. Currently, it's an ongoing thing. We are on the third of a trilogy, the final Terminus.
Ooh.
So it is ongoing. I mean, if you want to start here, go for it. But this is, you might be a little confused. This is a sequel. So, as I've said before, I wrote all of these for National Novel Writing Month, which, oh my God, is right now.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, whoa.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, this one I was clear. I remember when I wrote this one, and I wrote it in like one wild weekend when I was in Savannah. So I don't edit these that much because I kind of like looking at what was going through my head. Why did I write this as someone who's never had a child? And so much of it is about motherhood. But this chapter, I was like, oh, you were running. You were trying to get the word count. So I did edit this one a little bit more than I typically do. Also, we're going to talk about this a bit more at the end. This one has a lot of, I can tell what I was going through during this time. It's actually kind of oddly appropriate for what I think a lot of us are feeling right now after the 2024 election. It's a very like, you have just gotten beaten down. How are you going to move on from this? So for simplicity, just calling this Terminus Part 3. It was called Finite Children of Children. And again, I remember a lot of specifics about writing this. I have a friend who loves music, is very moved by music in a way that I'm kind of, as someone who's also moved by a lot of things, I'm like, wow, you are feeling this really powerfully. It's often like tears involved. One time I was at his place and I was telling him about these feelings I was feeling. And he was like, I have a song for you and I'm going to play it. And so he gets it out. And it was this song called Children of Children by Jason Isbell. And it has this line in it. I was riding on my mother's hip. She was shorter than the corn. All the years I took from her just by being born. And that was kind of, I think, what I was grappling with when I wrote this, of just feeling guilty about a lot of stuff that my mom had been through and how I felt somehow that it was my fault. So something to keep in mind, I guess, as we read this, as we go through this. He did cry at the end. It was a nice moment. I like, it stood out to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, content warning for non-explicit suicidality, painkillers, injuries, internalized shame, and just a general hopeless vibe starting at the top on this one. But yeah, so that's because it ended in a pretty hopeless place. So far, we have been following these two characters, Tilda and Madison, in this world that is dying. Humanity is dying because of this disease that you later find out was manufactured by a religious group. But because of all of that, and because the religious group called ARM works with the government, there is a board for better parenting, and they decide where, if a child is born, on rare occasion, they decide where the child goes. Tilda had her son Madison illegally, and they were going to take Madison from her. So she escaped with him, and they've been on the run for 8 years at this point. And they find a resistance is trying to make a vaccine that turns out the resistance isn't what they quite thought it was. And then they find out that the leader of ARM, the leaders are Madison's grandparents. And so there's a big confrontation that they have. And then Tilda gets a vaccine and gives it to Madison as one of only two. And she escapes after broadcasting over their national broadcast system about what happened and the truth of where this came from. And they've been on the run ever since, and there's been a lot of questions of what do we do now that Madison has been given the vaccine, and kind of Madison wrestling with that and feeling guilty, and Tilda feeling guilty because she doesn't know what to do. Hearing her mom over the system telling her, like, please come back because things are different now, and not trusting that. They had a pretty dangerous encounter with a moving group of people, and then they found another group of people that seemed like they were nice, but Tilda was still unwilling to trust them. And then as they parted ways, Tilda and Madison were attacked by people in tanks, and Madison was taken from her, and she was pretty brutally injured and shoved down a hill, left to die. And she doesn't know what she's gonna be. Her whole life has been defined by Madison, so she doesn't know what she's gonna do or be or anything. So that is where it ended, and that is where we'll pick up right now. The world fell into place in pieces. First was the smell, mildew and leaves heavy in Tilda's nose. Then the cold in the air and in her clothes and in her skin and in her bones, apart from her hot and swollen face. Throbbing pain and pulsing aches permeating every part of her body. Her right knee pulsated with agony, her left ankle pounding, her wrist throbbing with every heartbeat, her ribs tight and fiery. Her throat burned from screaming, her nose surely broken and impossible to breathe through. Memory came last, and when it did, it was like a live wire being placed against the base of her spine. She jolted up and instantly regretted it, crying aloud at the soreness. Madison. They'd taken Madison. She didn't know who they was, but her mind had a ready supply of dreadful possibilities. The force they'd used to take him did not lend her to be optimistic. Panic ballooned inside her so rapidly she struggled to breathe, made more difficult by the mess of blood clogging up her nostrils, spots erupting in her vision as she fought to hang on to her only recently won grasp on consciousness. Clumsy legs collapsed when she bolted to her feet, and she fell gracelessly into a heap of heaving flesh and bones. The sharpness in her chest was to such a degree that for a moment she thought she might die, not outright but slowly, as she was nowhere near medical care. A broken rib could be inching its way towards her lung, and there would be nothing she could do about it. While the thought frightened her, what truly scared her was the relief the idea of death gave her. No more struggling every day. No having to figure out how she was going to find Madison and save him, one frail young woman against what appeared to be a small infantry. But that was cowardly, and Madison needed her. So she sucked in several bracing breaths and, gradually this time, pushed herself to her knees, wincing as her pack pulled at her shoulders, resting there for a moment and combating the blackness at the edge of her vision. When Tilda had regained her hold on the world again, she slid one foot out from under her, wincing as she placed it on the forest floor. With Herculean effort, she hoisted herself up, her other foot clumsily stumbling out to the side to catch her weight. For a moment she swayed, panting with her eyes closed. Her arm came up to block out the light when she squinted open her eyes, her shoulder blades screaming in protest. She choked back a sob of pain, hopelessly looking at the hillside she'd rolled down leading back up to the road. Desperate, Tilda searched for another path back to the road, one that didn't involve her much-abused body climbing up a hill she'd only recently, if the light was anything to go by, fallen down when she barely had the strength to stand. But of course, there was none, not one that she could see. Swallowing with difficulty, with almost comical carefulness, she pivoted on her heels to examine the woods behind her, looking for any other alternate path, but all she found was a tangle of trees and brush. Reluctantly, she turned back to face the hill, in the darkest parts of her mind wondering if it was possibly worth it. What were the odds she'd ever be reunited with Madison again? Here was a guiltless out, as ugly as it was. Madison would never know, and nor would anyone else. But then she'd have to face herself, something she hadn't had time to do since giving birth to Madison almost 8 years ago. Not only that, she'd have to find a way to live with her decision, and she doubted she had the strength to do it. Which meant she had to find the strength to climb up this hill. Concentrating on putting one shaky foot in front of the other, she approached the incline, her breath loud and harsh in the silence. Her shoes, long without tread, slipped instantly at contact with the incline, and she fell to her hands and knees with a pain to shout. Long seconds passed where she could only think of dragging one agonized breath in after another, her tenuous hold on reality tunneling in and out. Madison the only thought anchoring her, the purpose to pull herself out of the gray world of non-being in the back of her mind that she so wanted to retreat to. The thought of standing again was laughable and simply out of the question. So instead, she did what was left to her and crawled forward on her hands and knees. The hill became an insurmountable mountain in her eyes. For every painfully earned foot, she slipped backwards almost equally as much and as painfully as much. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused them, frustrated with her lack of progress and unwilling to give up so quickly. Tilda's fingers dug into cold dirt, tore into dead leaves, the toes of her shoes buried into the dirt, each push forward up the hill carefully calculated and braced for into sheer force of will. Ever so slowly she made her way up the slope, the pain numbing her body, her breath coming in high-pitched, breathy gasps. A little after halfway up, her arm muscles gave out and she slid down several feet, losing a lot of ground. Tilda pressed herself against the earth, afraid of slipping again, on the verge of hyperventilating. For a long time, she listened to the sounds of the woods around her, the chirping of birds, rustling of leaves, her own raspy breathing, willing some strength to return to her arms. Her eyes closed as she summoned the dregs of her energy and pushed herself forward, locking her gaze on the road at the top of the hill, on her goal, and she strove for it, not thinking of anything else with the placement of her feet, the grip of her hands. Tilda almost sobbed with relief when she pulled herself up over the top, sprawling out onto the road. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the unmoving, crimson-splotched body of Scout, and she shuddered. Though she refused to look, she could not ignore it, a carcass fighting for her full attention. For a long time she lay there, her whole body trembling with effort and heaving with whistling breaths. Her mind went blank, her only focus on sucking in each agonizing breath after another. Her hand reached out blindly along the cool asphalt, searching automatically for Madison before remembering with a terrible rush that he'd been taken from her. Adrenaline shot through her and jolted her upward, but the pain almost instantly caused her to curl in on herself, wrapping her arm around her middle. As if abruptly, finally realizing something that had been there, obvious, all along. Everything was hopeless. Madison was gone, and she had no way to find him apart from a general direction. She'd been stupid to ever think she could protect him. It had only been a matter of time before he was taken for who knows what purpose. Would his captors put together that Madison was the child whose return came along with a hefty reward that the resistance was actively seeking and broadcasting about? And if they didn't, perhaps the last chance humanity had of recovering from the edge of extinction at creating a viable vaccine could be badly used or possibly even killed. It crashed over her, almost overwhelmed her. Tilda brought her hand up to her mouth and bit into it to hold back the tide of grief, the never-ending, bone-deep cries that threatened to rip up her throat and never stop until she was nothing more than a corpse, the victim of lack of will to go on. But because there was nothing else to do other than waste away on the side of the road, Tilda stood shakily, wobbly, fighting for her balance and for her thin grasp on consciousness. After a time, many factors more than what it usually took, Tilda was upright, body warped like a tree alone in the desert for 100 years. With terrible caution, she straightened, one arm still braced around her midsection. Down the road, Hazel eyes searched, her stringy hair whipping in front of her face. The asphalt stretching in front of her gave no clues as to Madison's location or what lay ahead on it. Desolate. What would she do when she got there, if she ever did? She did not want to think about it, because if she did, she feared she would not continue. The truth, if she dared face it, was she had no real chance of rescuing her child, unless she somehow found a stash of weapons or some other kind of equipment between now and wherever he was, if she ever found it. Tilda did not linger on the thought, knowing she did not have it in her to withstand an onslaught of unrelenting realism, no matter how much wiser it would be to deal with it now instead of before she started what was sure to be a perilous journey. Maybe I'll die before then. The thought surfaced again hazily as she took her first painful, lurching step, followed by another and another as she stumbled forward, breathing harshly through clenched teeth, appearing like a zombie, one of those walking dead she'd seen on the covers of books and magazines over the years. A raspy laugh bubbled past her lips, rapidly turning into a cough. Tilda felt hyper-aware of how loud she was being, her scraping steps, harsh panting breaths, walking, exposed, down the middle of a slab of road she knew was used by violent people. Her wandering mind replayed the events leading up to Madison's capture, first with fuzzy detail and then with brutal clarity. She couldn't help but wonder with morbid curiosity why they hadn't killed her, or made an effort to capture her as well. Maybe they'd assumed the fall had killed her. Maybe they considered her not worth the effort. Maybe they were conserving bullets. The landscape of her thoughts was wild and out of control, random memories surging to the forefront and quickly fading away again and being replaced by something else. Little was on her mind other than the singular focus of pushing onward. Out of habit, her eyes swept from left to right, hoping she'd be able to recognize something she could use. But on the one side was, of course, the hill she'd only so recently tumbled down and climbed back up. The hill that almost killed her. She hurled at it wordlessly and bitterly. The other side of the road was sparsely populated with drab buildings and overgrown grass. Nothing that looked promising for a hidden weapons or food cache. She swallowed dryly, the need for water barreling to the forefront of her body's many complaints. Though her neck protested painfully, she swiveled it to judge how far she'd come and very nearly groaned aloud at the embarrassing lack of ground she'd covered. In the distance, she could still clearly make out the dark shape of Scout's body, which she wrenched her gaze away from again in revulsion. Slowly and awkwardly, she maneuvered her pack from her shoulders and unzipped it, retrieving a cold bottle of water and, after a frustrating expenditure of energy opening it, did her best not to guzzle it all down. The liquid burned down her throat and settled uneasily in her stomach, but it did help her sluggishly zooming thoughts, chaotic and sickening in their own right. Feeling as though she'd run a long race and would like nothing more than to collapse, she slid the pack gingerly back into place on her shoulders and stiffly started forward once more. The people she was tracking had a tank, she thought with sudden fury. How the hell was she going to catch up with that? She wished with fierce concentration for something to help her. A random memory of Tilda's mother answering with simple assuredness Tilda's question of how stories seemed to work out, despite all odds, almost magically so. That they had to. The author wanted them to. The readers wanted them to. The God machine. A phrase that stuck with Tilda as something menacing, perpetually watching, lying in wait to stir things up if they got boring or people got complacent for its own entertainment, but at the same time, as its purpose. That's what made them stories, Leona Nova told her daughter. But this wasn't a story, Tilda reminded herself despairingly, as her dragging foot tripped over a rut in the road and sent a flare of pain spiking up her ankle. If the God machine existed, she figured it was broken down now and no longer properly working, instead only churning out more and more misery and nothing to fix it. Pointless waste, all of it. In a daze, she contemplated turning around and searching out the group she split ways with on their way to DC, asking for help from them or the resistance. But still her exhausted legs carried her towards Madison, thinking of him, scared and alone, cringing as he was yelled at, wringing his hands. As the sun sank lower in the sky, she approached the outskirts of a town at the seat of a range of blue mountains called Shawsville. She'd have to stop. Even though now she'd hit a stride, if it could be called that, of shuffling robotic steps, she felt she could keep going forever. That stopping and hoping she could find the will to start again was more misguided. Nonetheless, a wound in her side had started to bleed, warm blood trickling over the fingers she was using in an attempt to stem the flow, and if she even gave a passing thought to the pain in her ankle, she nearly passed out. Tilda had become accustomed to the flavor of agony associated with keeping it in constant motion. Keeping it still, it crescendoed into something much less manageable. But she knew she must be doing more damage to it and thus hurting herself more in the long run, as well as undercutting her ability, ultimately, to be of any use when it came to rescuing Madison. So, as unsavory as it was, she needed to find some shelter for the night to deal with her wounds. All while the people who had taken Madison got further and further away. Shawsville was a small town. As with much of this straight and flat highway they'd been traveling on, Tilda could see much of what lay ahead and thought she could see all the way to the other side of the town as she passed the sign. Population 1,301. Most of the town seemed to be concentrated in a square to the right of the highway, so Tilda turned that way, her hazy vision skimming signs for the red cross that indicated medical supplies. She came to a four-way stop. A precursory look at all the options had her turning left, further into town, with its buildings with shingle roofs, all faded whites and browns and blacks, strings of lights crisscrossing across the street, big red bows now brittle with weather and age tied around iron lamp post. A banner, slumped with missing letters, hung across the middle of the square, reading, "Welcome to Shawsville." It was all very quaint and sad in the emptiness left behind by a town that Tilda was sure had either died off or migrated to somewhere else with more supplies. She hoped that didn't mean there were no supplies left. Her stomach somersaulted with the anticipation of relief when her eyes landed on a small pharmacy. She limped over, praying that it was by some miracle unlocked or the windows already broken out. As she got closer, she saw the glass door was open, which was both a good and bad thing. It certainly did not bode well that the supplies hadn't been raided. The worn-down soles of her shoes slipped on the crushed glass like sand in the doorway as she stepped carefully into the darkness of the pharmacy, ears perked for any sounds of life as her eyes adjusted. She hovered in the doorway, the pain in her body climbing as she stood statuesque and waited for her vision to clear. Eventually, the darkness distilled into shelves, many lopsided, hanging only by a few screws on one side. Some collapsed entirely. But though they had obviously been picked through, they weren't cleared, and the pharmacy was larger on the inside than she'd first expected. Being careful not to slip over glass or old coupon papers that had practically melted into the floor with time, because another fall would probably do her in at this point, she walked down the first aisle, snatching up a bottle of painkillers she spotted way in the back of the shelf, some caffeine strips, the few remaining granola bars, and crushed packs of candy. Her arms full of supplies, she was forced to slide off her pack and dump them in the front pocket, abandoning all pretenses of organization in her current state. The next aisle produced much less, mostly cheap electronics that no longer had any purpose, and souvenirs she had difficulty fathoming were popular even before HSV-5 had decimated the population. A small selection of toys that made her stomach clench and worry. Over one aisle was a mix of cold and sinus medicine, which was almost completely cleared out, and a plethora of stomach ailment remedies. Tilda swept whatever was left indiscriminately into her pack. After that was a row of feminine hygiene products and condoms, which seemed laughable to her now. She hadn't had a period in years, and as for condoms, it was almost sad how wonderful a concept to ever live in a society that would need those seemed to her. The only reason she knew what they were was out of a curiosity of reading the back of the package many years ago when she had first started out her life on the road and on the run with Madison. At first she thought she'd misread the instructions, the designated use, or that there must be a mistake, a misprint. But several inspected boxes and packets later, she confirmed that there was no error. What a relic these were now, a true representation of how life was different after HSV-5, the line before and after, which separated two distinct sets of worries. Tilda skipped this row, in too much pain to spend time down an aisle dedicated to useless but fascinating throwbacks to an extinct way of life. At the pharmacist's counter, she found a few things that might be of use. While almost all of the prescription medications were gone, she did find some muscle relaxants. Down the second-to-last aisle, she located a handful of bandages and brace wraps, some antiseptic and rubbing alcohol, some creams that promised muscle relief. As she suspected, the long-defunct cooler along the back had been emptied out, save for some spoiled milk-based products and energy shots. The last row she quickly deemed as useless, one side dedicated to makeup and hair, the other to greeting cards, another reminder of a time long gone. Every part of her now clamoring loudly for her attention, she located the bathroom in the back corner, which thankfully had a small window to allow in the rapidly waning light. Tilda folded down the baby-changing station. What an unimaginable concept that was, too, and spilled out her spoils, grimacing at the pain in her side. There was a stool in the back corner. She wasn't sure what it had been used for, but she was glad it was there. Tilda dragged it across the floor and situated it in front of her makeshift work area. She did a double-take and gasped, catching sight of someone in the room with her, but it was only her reflection in the grimy, rusted mirror. Slowly, the tension left her muscles and she exhaled deeply several times, staring at her ghastly appearance. Her face was one massive, bloody bruise, her nose and the left side of it swollen to about twice their usual size. Blood, turned black with age and exposure to air, covered much of her skin. One of her eyes was ringed with dark purple, the white of it stained with red. Her jacket was stiff with dried blood as well, a splotch of dark on her right side. Streaks of it painted her hair and her fingers. Tilda's throat tightened as she looked away, inexplicably ashamed. She rummaged through her pack and dug out some antiseptic wipes, perching uncomfortably on the stool to give her feet and ankles some relief, which unfortunately translated to a nauseating swell of pain. Swallowing back bile, she extricated herself from her jacket, shivering at the cool air, and began the laborious process of wiping the blood off her arms, her face, going through several wipes before she even got to her midsection. She tried to figure out a way to proceed with her shirt on, but could not, so she wriggled out of it, gasping with the lancing pain in her shoulders and ribs as she did so. The fabric was disgustingly crusty and hard as she laid it out on the changing table on top of her jacket. Next, she slid off her boots and her blood-filled socks, almost falling out of her chair at the sudden agony this caused from her right ankle no longer being braced. It was comically, terribly swollen. Groaning, she stood, keeping her weight off her right ankle as much as possible by balancing with only its toes as she shed her torn and dirty jeans, knowing she'd have to inspect her throbbing knee and place them on top of the jacket and shirt. Taking several steadying breaths, Tilda wiped the blood from her feet and her middle, more than a little disheartened when she could scrub at a particular stubborn patch, only to discover it was just a bruise. It suddenly occurred to her that now would be a good time for some painkillers before she started going about manhandling and trying to set sprains and potentially broken bones. A shaky hand deposited 3 pills into the palm of her other one, and she popped them into her mouth, swigging them down with a large gulp of water. Doing her best not to dwell too much on what she was about to do, she probed her ankle with gentle fingers, experimentally rotating it with not much success, but several curse words. Biting her lip, she flexed it, determining it was sprained and not broken. She grabbed from her pile of supplies a brace wrap, struggling for several minutes with the packaging. Once she finally opened it, she set about wrapping her ankle, wondering how she possibly could fit this back in her shoe. It took a few times of rewrapping for her to achieve the proper level of tightness so that it stuck but was not cutting off her circulation. From there, Tilda worked upward, examining bruised calves and a green and purple swollen mess that surrounded her knee. Unsure of the best way to handle a busted knee, she cleaned the ugly size along the outside of it with antiseptic and yet another string of curse words, and breath hissed through her teeth, then tested the muscle cream on it, which at first was uncomfortably cold but then suddenly warmed and became soothing. This she wrapped loosely with bandages. Next, she tackled the explosion of purple and blue and red that was her left side. Touching it gingerly had her whipping back her hand in pain and bending over, robbed of all conscious thought as the pain demanded all of her attention. Not good. Tentatively, she straightened again, wheezing, tears squeezing at the corners of her eyes. The light was fading. She had to deal with this now. With her fingers, she examined her ribs for any breaks but did not discover any. That didn't mean she was free of fractures, but there was no way of testing that she knew of. Not without some equipment that she was missing. A deep cut just above her hip bone was the source of the blood. Carefully, she cleaned it, crying out as the antiseptic burned like acid. Her tight throat made the already annoyingly difficult task of breathing even harder. Tilda patted the wound, which had begun bleeding again, a small eruption of red, but it quickly stopped, and she had fixed a bandage over it. Sitting as straight as she could, she awkwardly set about unspooling a length of bandage around her midsection, the whole thing an exercise in discipline. The diminishing of the light infused everything with urgency, which made her slow progress all the more torturous, her fingers clumsier, sloppier. She ran out of the white gauze before she would have liked. A second layer of wrap would have been preferable. But she didn't have much left, and she still had a wrist to wrap, so one layer would have to do. Tilda gave an experimental twist of her wrist, wincing, touching it with gentle fingers, and concluded that it too was more likely sprained than broken. Overall, she'd been lucky, she thought grimly, a stark recollection of her reflection swimming to the surface of her thoughts. The wrist was more quickly wrapped and with just enough bandage for a secure fit. Tilda wrinkled her nose at the dirt and blood jammed underneath her nails. Reluctantly turning her attention to the mirror and the dregs of the remaining light, she inspected her face, now free from all of the blood but not much improved in appearance. Her nose was visibly broken. With cautious fingers, she tested the swollen fixture, wondering if she could set it herself, pop it back into place, or if the pain was even worth it. With all the swelling, it was just impossible to tell how much her appearance was truly impacted, but if it was just a superficial thing, did she care? What did she care if one more quirk was added to a face that already did not meet the standards of conventional beauty? Still, she pressed against it, trying to right it, gasping in pain as she did so. Blood gushed out suddenly and she halted, reaching for the paper towel dispenser above the changing station and pressing the material to her nostrils, pinching the bridge of her nose. Just another memento given to me by another, she thought. No big deal. But she could feel her eyes glossing over at the injustice of it, even as she told herself it would do no good to think about it. By the time the bleeding stopped, the bathroom was sheathed in darkness. For a very tragic moment, she debated if she should trash her clothes or put them back on, but in the end she found herself sliding back into them, wincing at both the hardened fabric and the twinging it caused when it came into contact with her bandaged wounds. The socks she changed, tossing the old ones, soaked through and stiff with blood, into the trash. They did not change shape as they sailed through the air and hit the side of the bin. Tilda fished into the bottom of her pack and produced another pair of socks, unrolling them and inching them on her feet. Her right shoe would have to stay off for now, she decided. She also pulled out her flashlight and replaced the item she'd collected into her bag in a less haphazard manner, pausing at the bottle of muscle relaxant, but deciding it'd be better to save that for whenever she found a place to sleep for the night. Somewhere nearby, she didn't have time or the energy to search too far. As she exited the bathroom, afraid the beam of her flashlight would catch the gleam of someone's eyes, she turned down the aisle she so quickly rejected earlier of hair and makeup, inventorying the products for anything that might help her get blood out of her hair, picking up something called dry shampoo near the end of the row, promising no water needed. She also grabbed a brush, sliding both into a side pocket of her pack, and stepped back out into the cold to the square made eerie by the new darkness, illuminated by a cone of white light emanating from her flashlight. Sticking to the sidewalk, she read the signs as best she could as she headed deeper into the town center, hoping to find a hotel or bed and breakfast. She did her best to keep her right socked foot in minimum contact with the cold asphalt. Tilda took her right, limping her way down the main thoroughfare, her breath fogging in front of her. The feeling that something was missing, like a phantom limb, was unshakable without Madison by her side. She turned down a residential street, dotted with small houses painted with what must have once been flamboyant colors, now overgrown lawns sporting dilapidated signs and decorations, ornate mailboxes posted at the end of every driveway. Tilda picked one a little further in on her right, making her way up a stone path into the door, ridiculously raising her fist to knock on it before sheepishly lowering her hand and testing the knob. Powerful relief surging through her like a drug when it swung open with a loud, whining sound. She stepped into the foyer, listening, shutting the door behind her, shining her light around her surroundings. It was just as small as it appeared from the outside. 1 story, 3 rooms. Not much warmer than it was outside, Tilda thought as another cloud of breath escaped past her lips. The previous owners had taken down their photos, presumably to take them to wherever they evacuated to, but other than that, the place looked largely intact. Further into the house, Tilda ventured, slowly, sweeping her light around for any threats, or conversely, anything she could use. Before she would allow herself to lie down on the blue poofy couch she spied in the living room, she had to ensure the house was danger-free, and also she wanted to check for any supplies in case she had to leave in a hurry. Opening doors along the main hallway, she first found the bathroom, searching the cabinets under the sink and the medicine cabinet, but finding nothing of use. The next room was the master bedroom, the closet cleaned out apart from some articles of clothing deemed unworthy of saving. Some ugly sweaters that Tilda debated but quickly decided against. Dresses, what looked to be business clothes. The room across the hall was a child's room, outfitted with twin beds and a blue and green color scheme. Tilda's heart clenched again, and she left and shut the door behind her, not having the stomach to search it. In the kitchen, she also found nothing of use, so she stumbled back to the couch and collapsed onto it, exhaustion permeating her aching bones. She saw the flashlight on the table and dug out the muscle relaxants, retrieving 2, and swallowed them whole with a couple of gulps of water, replacing everything once she was done. Her stomach was too unsettled to even entertain the idea of food, so she switched off her light and curled up on her side to ease the pain of her ribs and ankle, pulled the comforter draped along the couch's back down and snuggled beneath it, sleepiness and the need for her body to heal overcoming the pulsing aches that threatened to keep her anchored to consciousness. Tilda was asleep almost immediately, too tired to be afraid. That brings us to the end of this chapter. This was very much a introspective chapter of like what's going to happen next, and her trying to grapple with what's going to happen next, especially when what do? You don't know where they went. So her trying to deal with all of that and being very, very like at the lowest point of the low. And when I was reading back over this, it did kind of, I mean, this is a really grim chapter. It did kind of make me laugh, though, because, and I apologize to Christina because I kept being like, oh, yeah, I remember that. But like, it's a very like, oh, it's that time I broke my ankle and then I was in the woods and I had to keep going. Oh, it's that time I broke my nose. Oh, it's that time I fell down a hill and couldn't get back up. Like, it's a very, I remember all of those instances. And then the town she like goes into, that's my small town. Like the Christmas decorations on the square. I mean, it's not unique to my small town, but that is very much what I was going for in my head. So it's strange. That's one of the things that I've found interesting about revisiting these is how clearly I remember like where I was mentally when I wrote it, but also these very specific, in this case, times of feeling like hopelessness or I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what I'm going to do next. That's very powerful, powerful feeling. But this one, this part of the trilogy is the shortest part. So without giving too much away, things are going to happen pretty quick. So if you're like, oh God, I hope you don't stay in this moment forever. It doesn't stay like this. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you come back and check it out. I'm excited to get to the end and hear what you all think. Hear any theories if you have them. But yeah, in the meantime, huge shout out to Christina as always, who does these. These are extra work. She makes them sound amazing. And yeah, if you would like to contact us, you can email us at stuffmediamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast or on Instagram and TikTok as Stuff One Never Told You. We're also on YouTube. We have TeePublic Store and we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. And yeah, thanks as always to our super producer Christina, our executive producer Maya, and our contributor Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff One Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.